Well, welcome to another Friday night. I want to start a new series, and it's going to be on the characteristics of complex trauma. And you go, well, you've already done a series on this. So let me explain. 7 years ago, the very first series that we filmed professionally that became part of the YouTube repertoire of videos was on what started out as the 50 characteristics of complex trauma. And by the end, it grew to the 60 characteristics of complex trauma. So that was 7 years ago. And where all of that came from was when I started over 20 years ago, I was working with people with addiction issues and in a treatment center that saw it as a symptom of deeper issues. And we really understood it was childhood issues, though trauma really wasn't understood at that time. But Janet Wojtitz had put out a book called The 13 Characteristics of Adult Children of Alcoholics. And I read it and I thought, wow, this really describes the people that I work with. So I started using it in one of the workshops, and it really resonated with the clients. And what began to happen though is I began to see other characteristics besides just the 13. And pretty soon I was doing a workshop where we taught 25 characteristics of complex trauma. Then it grew to 30, then at 40, then 50. And then we started the filming project, and by the end it grew to 60. So I've been keeping this list for many years as I've got to understand complex trauma better, as I work with clients at an in-depth basis, where I begin to spot just consistent patterns that are consistent with what comes out of complex trauma. And so I keep a list and write it down. So I got thinking, it's been 7 years. My list right now is about 85. So maybe we need to do a refilm of this whole characteristics of complex trauma. And so I've done in-depth videos on many of these characteristics. The purpose of this is to bring all 85 together. I'm going to do it in a 10-part series that just helps you see back to back to back. This is what comes out of complex trauma. If you want more detail, you can look at the other videos that are available on YouTube. I think it's important to start with where these characteristics come from. And it's really an understanding that complex trauma affects basically two things. It affects every part of what makes you human. It affects your brain, it affects you physically, emotionally, relationally, how we cope, our identity, and it affects all of it negatively. And so some of these characteristics are going to be showing how complex trauma, the ramifications on the whole of who we are as people. The second thing is that in order for a child to survive, they had to adapt. And so they developed patterns of behavior, patterns of thinking, emotions that enable them to feel less pain, enable them to try to get their needs met, enable them to survive in an unsafe environment. And those patterns of behavior later became maladaptive behaviors. They now cause pain to others. They now cause pain to themselves, but they let them survive as children. And so some of these characteristics are identifying those maladaptive behaviors, things they did to survive. So this is really trying to put words into how complex trauma affects a person in every aspect of life. Now, when I've taught the characteristics of complex trauma in the past, sometimes people, when they hear it and they hear all this negative ramifications of complex trauma, I think because of their own shame, they go to, oh, Tim's looking down on us. Tim's judging us. Tim's just up there saying we're terrible people. Please know that's the last thing I'm doing. I have nothing but love and respect for people with complex trauma. I have complex trauma. I have some of these characteristics. My whole goal in doing this is to help people realize that this is what an innocent child did to try to survive. I'm not trying to punish the innocent child who's trying to survive. I'm describing the things they did to survive and trying to put words into it, because it's not till 20, 30 years later that you begin to realize that these survival adaptations are actually hurting me now. They're actually hurting other people that I love now. And now it helps you understand where they come from. It helps you understand you just can't say, oh, I need to change that and stop doing that. No, you got to deal with the trauma. And so it's just to provide a roadmap for people so that they can begin to change the things they see now in their adult life that are actually harmful to themselves and others. So let's begin. And again, I'm going to do a quick summary of the characteristics. Some will go into a bit more detail, but it's to really give you an overview of the lay of the land that comes out of complex trauma. So I want to start with a big picture of complex trauma. And it's really that complex trauma changes a child's or an adult's priorities from going down a path of love to going down a path of survival. So it's important to realize that the brain, when a child is born, it has two big priorities. It wants love, but it also wants to survive. Both of those are very important. When a child has both love and safety, the things it needs to have both of those priorities met, then they feel loved, they feel safe, their needs are met, their love pod is full, and then they choose to live a healthy life. They choose to love others. Love becomes a priority for them to treat others the way they want to be treated. That's what comes out of a healthy life. But what comes out of a child in complex trauma, a child where it isn't safe? What then happens is the brain says survival now must become a higher priority than love. I have to survive, so I have to do things that go against love. So the brain is willing to sacrifice the priority of love in order to survive, because safety becomes the ultimate priority. And so what happens when a person then is in survival mode? It's no longer about love, it's now about the laws of the jungle, the survival of the fittest. So anything in the jungle that makes you weak, that makes you vulnerable, you got to get rid of, because that's where somebody's going to destroy you. That's where it's going to take away your chances of survival. So anything that makes you vulnerable is seen as a weakness. So if I have weak emotions, I cry, I get sad, if I show empathy, if I show love, if I am vulnerable and share openly, if I have a conscience, all of those things make me vulnerable for others to have power over me and to destroy me. So I have to get rid of everything that I think makes me weak, that keeps me from surviving and being the fittest. So the path to survival is not love. The path to survival is to be strong in the sense of not having any of those vulnerable weaknesses. So power is now seen as the greatest attainment, as the most valuable attribute. You got to be strong. You got to be stronger than everybody else. Love actually makes you weak. So there's a huge shift in priorities that you can see. What then is important to understand comes out of that is, in the mind of the law of the jungle, the survival of the fittest, to be stronger, actually what they're saying is you become less human. You get rid of the human parts of you that make you vulnerable, therefore that make you weak. The main piece of strength is physical strength, hardness, not affected by anything. You have no leverage points. That is what makes you strong. So you have to then murder your soul. You have to murder all the parts that make you vulnerable. So to become stronger, you have to become less human. The reality is that actually makes you weaker overall, but not in a jungle environment, but in a love environment that makes healthy relationships, healthy living impossible. So bottom line is, what comes out of complex trauma is My needs must be more important than your needs. Survival of the fittest. I got to be stronger than you. And so I will have a change of priorities. What you can see with that is that then creates, within complex trauma, narcissistic tendencies. I must be more important than you. My needs must matter more than yours. That's the only way that I can survive. Now, it's important, I think, to understand is that this works itself out typically in 3 different ways in people's lives. So some go to pure narcissists. All they care about is themselves, looking good. Everybody else is a pawn on a chessboard to be used. They don't know how to love. They don't show any empathy, don't have a conscience, pure narcissism. Some go that route. But there's 2 other routes that most from complex trauma go to. And this is what I want you to understand. Some go to fawning or codependency, people pleasing. I'll take care of you. I'll put your needs ahead of mine. I will never say no to you. I'll give you whatever you want. I'll make sacrifice after sacrifice for you. And it looks, how can that be narcissistic? How can that be the path of not love? That looks like love through and through. That looks like the most loving person in the world. The key is this. True love is love unconditional. I love regardless of whether I get anything or not. This is, I'm giving you love with the hope that I will get, with the hope that you won't hurt me, with the hope that I'll earn your love and you will meet my needs and you will give me respect and safety. This is a roundabout way to survive, where my needs are still the ultimate, but I just can't go there directly. I have to go by giving in order that you will give to me. So I give to get. So that becomes what many do, and it's a subtle way that this shift to priorities works itself out. Then there's a third thing. Many in recovery, when they're finally around safe people, they aren't like this at all. They go to the priority of living by love. They're wonderful people, and they go, okay, I don't see this characteristic in my life. How can this characteristic be true of me? But when they get triggered with an intense emotion, fear, anger, stress, they get a limbic brain that's triggered, and all of a sudden, it becomes all about them. All of a sudden, it's you better do what I want. Their expectations of others go up. They become very demanding. They lash out at others. They go back to the survival of the fittest. They go back to that old change of priority system. Now, what I want to spend the rest of our time on today is looking at how trauma affects our body. And that's both our physical body and our brain. So these ones are quite common, and I'll go through them quickly. They're common in kind of PTSD research. But number 1, people with complex trauma have hypervigilance. So they're just a heightened alertness to danger. They must always be on guard, checking for danger. And so they're constantly scanning faces, scanning their environment. They go into a room with 100 people, and 99 people can smile at them, but one person could scowl, and that's the person they become obsessed with. They focus on. There's just that constant on guard alertness. Second or third characteristic is a heightened startle response. So you picture kind of a cat that gets scared, and it jumps straight up, its claws go out, its hair stands on end, it arches its back, it hisses. That's kind of what happens for many people with complex PTSD. So I remember vividly a woman that was at a Friday night meeting, and somebody came up behind her and tapped her on the shoulder, and she just jumped, screamed, went through the roof, got angry, lashed out, and then the man touched her arm to try to calm her, and that just made her go off even more. So it's that heightened startle response now that comes out of the trauma from the past. The next one is hypersensitivity within your 5 senses, particularly when it comes to sound, light, and touch. So because of the trauma of childhood, and this is often in more extreme trauma, you are now more sensitive to light, more sensitive to sound, and more sensitive to touch. You just don't like being touched. It just makes your skin crawl. You can see evidence of this often that when you're sitting in a room and somebody's eating, just hearing them chew drives you crazy. It makes your skin crawl. Or somebody sneezes a couple times, that bothers you. Many people need to sleep with a noise machine, a white noise, because they just can't sleep otherwise. They just hear every little sound in the night. Many need sunglasses when they're outside, even when it's not super sunny, because their eyes are so sensitive to light. That can improve for many people as they heal, as they grow, but some will always have little bits of that for the rest of their life. It's just their senses have been changed because of trauma. The next one is sleep issues. Pretty well everybody with complex trauma has trouble sleeping. And so difficulty falling asleep. They fall asleep for a couple hours, then they are awake for the rest of the night, or they're just sleepy all the time in the day. A lot of people, there's a lot of movement in their sleep, and that keeps waking them up. Many people have headaches after they wake up, or nightmares constantly wake them up. And so they're having dreams and they're just jerking violently in their sleep and waking up. So there's just a ton of sleep issues. We've done a talk on this recently, but just to summarize kind of what causes this. So what we know, and I'm going to talk about it a lot in this series, is cortisol. So when you're in constant danger, you got cortisol pumping, and that causes great difficulty in being able to go to sleep. Secondly, when you're in constant danger, you're in your sympathetic nervous system all the time, and you need to be in your parasympathetic in order to have a deep sleep. But if you're in your sympathetic nervous system all the time, you can't go into a deep sleep. Then, if you're hypervigilant all the time, if you were sexually abused as a child or you were attacked in the night, and so your hypervigilance wasn't just in daytime hours, but you now have to be hypervigilant even at night. You don't allow yourself to go into a deep sleep because something bad might happen. So you train yourself to be a light sleeper. So for many, that meant there's this deep fear that when I go into a deep sleep, I lose control. So I can't go into a deep sleep because then I would lose control. Many develop a fear that if I go into a deep sleep, I'm going to have nightmares again, bad dreams. So deep sleep is a scary place to go. So I don't want to do that. Some, when they were children, their parents took them to bars and kept them awake half the night. There's parties through the night. And so they never got consistent sleep. Their sleep was irregular. Their sleep was interrupted all the time. And so now they just don't have a good system in their brain that is used to a schedule for sleeping. And it's a problem thing. Others, because of their complex trauma, had anxiety issues, which developed into asthma issues, other health issues, and those all prevented healthy sleep. And all of that hypersense stuff that we just talked about affects sleep as well. And so sleep becomes a huge characteristic for most people with complex trauma. The next one is body dysmorphic disorder. And so it's a condition where you can't stop thinking about one or more perceived defects or flaws in your appearance. So the flaw probably appears minor to others, or they don't even see the flaw, but to you it's big, and you feel embarrassed by it, ashamed of it, anxious every time you go into social situations. And it's always been fascinating to me that most people with complex trauma have some body dysmorphia. They don't like their body. So some people aren't quite sure if this is true of them. So let me give you just some of the characteristics of body dysmorphia. So extremely preoccupied with a perceived flaw in your appearance that to others appears minor. A strong belief that you have a defect in your appearance that makes you ugly or deformed. A belief that others take special notice of your appearance in a negative way and mock you behind your back. Attempt to hide perceived flaws with styling, with makeup, with clothes. You engage in behaviors aimed at fixing or hiding what you perceive as your flaws, and you can't resist or control engaging in those behaviors, such as frequently checking the mirror, skin picking, constantly grooming yourself. You constantly compare your appearance with others. You frequently seek reassurance from others about your appearance. You have perfectionist tendencies when it comes to your appearance. You seek cosmetic procedures to improve your appearance, but you end up not satisfied with them. And you avoid social situations. So body dysmorphia is just, to me, such a huge issue, and we're going to see kind of more of the root issues around that come out of complex trauma. The next one is brain fog. And so that's where there's just, your brain's in a fog. You can't think clearly. Your mind goes blank. You might even feel a bit dizzy. All of a sudden, you can't find the right words, and so you have trouble talking to people. Or you hear kind of a static in your brain where it's almost noisy in your head and it's hard to hear other people. Or you hear voices in your brain arguing, telling you not to do stuff. Or all of a sudden there's confusion in your brain where you're not sure what to think or do. Or you listening to people and you have trouble grasping concepts or learning new concepts as quickly as you normally do. Or you forget tasks. You're working on something, then you forget kind of what you're supposed to be doing next or what you're even supposed to be doing right now. And then it takes much longer to complete a task, way longer than it normally does. You just frequently feel distracted. You have trouble following a conversation. And so your brain is just sluggish. You can't think as fast as you normally do. It's like you're walking through wet cement. You can even have difficulty concentrating. You feel sleepy. Some people, their vision even becomes a bit blurry. It gets hard to figure out what's going on here. You're almost in a stupor, like somebody cast a magic spell on you. You can't remember stuff short term. You just start to feel disconnected from your surroundings, disoriented, and you lose your train of thought. Some go to the point where the brain fog is so severe that they feel like they're watching as a spectator what's going on in their life. They're an outsider and they can't somehow participate in it. Or they even feel like they're drunk or under the influence. Or they can't process time. They lose track of time. And so it just leads to very difficult second-guessing yourself all the time. So what we know from complex trauma, why it leads to brain fog, is that it's actually the brain trying to protect the child. It's a severe survival strategy. Now, I need to say that brain fog can be caused by hormonal changes in pregnancy, change in diet, abuse of alcohol, results of certain medications. But the brain fog I'm talking about comes out of complex trauma. And so what the brain is doing is the child is in something that is so painful. It is beyond the child's ability to deal with. They can't fight or flight, and they can't handle it. It's too painful. So the brain is afraid that something unthinkable is going to happen to this child if it allowed the child to see and experience and feel accurately what was going on in their life. And it just can't allow them to go there. It would destroy the child. And so the brain basically does a couple things. Number one, it releases cortisol. And cortisol gives you the energy to fight or flight, but they can't do that. And so cortisol has a secondary effect. It takes the cortex offline so the child can't think clearly. That's what the brain is trying to protect them from, is thinking clearly, seeing things accurately. The brain becomes foggy in the cortex. But then the brain does a second thing. It releases opioids. And opioids are designed to help the child dissociate from the external world so that they don't even feel present in the present. They're able to escape into an internal world. It kind of numbs the external world. It takes them to this safe little internal world, all to protect them. And so the brain then becomes very foggy. And so what happens for people coming out of complex trauma is in adult life, when they get into stressful situations where they start to feel overwhelmed, then brain fog can come back. And it's very difficult to deal with, but it's one of the realities of complex trauma. The next one, which is so disruptive for many people from complex trauma, is intrusive thoughts. So an intrusive thought is an unwelcome, involuntary thought, image, or an unpleasant idea that becomes an obsession. It's upsetting, it's distressing, and it just feels you can't manage it or get rid of it. It just keeps coming in like it takes power, it takes control. And so it becomes very paralyzing. It's anxiety provoking. So for many people, these intrusive thoughts are associated with episodic memories. So stuff that happened in the past that keeps intruding, or unwanted worries, things they fear are going to happen, or urges. Images that are kind of inappropriate, aggressive, sexual, blasphemous behavior. Those keep popping in. So they typically are around a bunch of different categories. So it can be germs, infections, types of contamination. Or it can be fear that the person or loved ones are going to get sick, hurt, or die. Or it can be violent acts of aggression causing harm to other people. Or it can be thoughts of harming yourself or suicide. Or it can be doubts about doing tasks wrong or leaving tasks unfinished. Or it can be kind of religious, blasphemous, that you're a terrible person, you're an immoral person, that God is going to judge you type of stuff. Or it can be about acting out in public or saying something disgraceful. Or it can be memories of something that you want to forget, or unwanted sexual thoughts, including thoughts of being sexually assaulted or sexually assaulting another person. Or it can be thoughts that you will harm or sexually abuse a child. Or it can be fears that you will do something extremely dangerous or illegal. Or worries that you forgot something important, like turning the oven off. So that's the kind of intrusive thoughts that come in. And once they come in, it is so hard to stop them. You can't control them. You feel powerless against them. And they just paralyze you, cause all kinds of anxiety. So I need to say right up front with this that there's many myths around intrusive thoughts. And one of the most distressing myths is that some people have begun to say that if you have an intrusive thought, that must mean you want to do it. And I go, that is exactly the opposite of what is true. The reason it causes so much distress to people is they don't want to do it. So what's going on here? Why is it that people have intrusive thoughts? So what we know, again, is that it's so connected to trauma, complex trauma. So what comes out of complex trauma? Intense stress that is overwhelming, that you just cannot happen. And that can lead to intrusive thoughts. Deep depression, deep negative thoughts, deep anxiety, deep fear thoughts. All of those create intrusive thoughts. And then profound loneliness, profound emotional pain, profound feelings of helplessness, profound feelings of shame. And for many people, that results in a powerful internal critic or hearing their parents' voice. And those just keep popping thoughts into your mind. The old messages that you're a loser, we'd be better off without you. Do us a favor and disappear from our lives. You killed your mother and I wish you were dead. Those just pop in. And then every time you do something in your life, you just hear negative, critical thoughts that pop in. That comes out of complex trauma. And then deep wounds, deep unresolved hurts, deep unmet needs that have been there all of your life. Those can create intrusive thoughts. So let me give you an example of that. So many parents love their children, want their children to be healthy, but once in a while they get overwhelmed with the responsibility of caring for their children, the needs of their children, the problems they're having with their children, that all of a sudden this thought pops into their head that they should run away from home. They wish they could kill themselves. They wish their children drowned and they didn't have to deal with their children anymore. And they feel so badly, but they really love their children. So that is a parent with unmet needs, deep trauma, that their needs weren't met for so many years. So now with children who have special needs at that given point in time, they have to give, and their needs are being unmet again. And that deep wound is being triggered. And so what that thought is the limbic brain coming up with a solution that would create temporary relief. If I didn't have children, if my children died, if I ran away from home, that would fix everything. That is not what they really want to do. That is just their limbic brain coming up with an instant gratification solution. So what is so important to understand with this is many people have felt for years and have been taught that your brain is kind of one unit. So if you have a thought, that's your whole brain wanting that thought, thinking that thought. And therefore, when you get an intrusive thought, that must be that you want it. That must be your whole brain coming to that conclusion. And what we've begun to realize is, no, our brain is made up of many, many different parts. It's not one cohesive unit. We got the limbic brain and the cortex brain, and the limbic brain can desire something very different from what the cortex brain develops. And so it's beginning to realize that what complex trauma does is it creates stuff in one part of the brain that is very different from what a healthy cortex wants. That's where the intrusive thoughts come from. That's not saying you want it. That's not saying that that's the big picture of your life. That's just saying that part of your brain that's not been healed yet, that's been deeply affected by complex trauma in its conclusions, in its feelings, that's been triggered. And now it's coming up with this thought. The next one is dissociation. And to me, dissociation is so important to understand because all of complex trauma leads to some degree of dissociation. You have to disconnect to an extent from your present environment because it's so painful. So a child that is too little to fight or flight, so they can't resolve the situation. They can't get out of the situation by escaping or changing their external world. So their only way to survive is to retreat into an internal world, to dissociate. So Bruce Perry has said dissociation is the ability to emotionally flee into an internal world where one can disconnect from the external world. Let me take you back to opioids. So originally when there's danger, the brain goes to cortisol, which gives you energy to fight or flight. And it basically says, don't think, so I'm going to shut down the cortex. You just need to act, fight or flight. But if a child is too little to fight or flight, then the brain goes, okay, we have to go to another option to protect this child. So cortisol, that's not working. Let's release opioids in the system. So what cortisol did was it increased the blood pressure, it increased your heart rate, it sent blood into every part of your body, to every muscle group. It added extra sugar to the body, got adrenaline happening, so you had extra energy to fight or flight. You could run faster and harder. But that's not working. So when opioids are released, what that does is it brings all the blood from the extremities and pools it around the heart. That's part one. Part two is it releases opioids to medicate pain. So it's slowing down all your major organs, it's pooling blood, it's dulling pain. What's it saying? Let's get ready to get cut or hurt so we don't feel it as much. But then it allows the child to step out of the present and escape to an internal world. So it's saying to be present in the present is too painful. So we want to be anywhere but present in the present. So that then becomes dissociation. Now, it's really important to understand that dissociation takes place on a continuum. So there's very mild forms of dissociation and there's extreme forms of dissociation. People from complex trauma will have one form of dissociation or another. Everybody will at least have the mild forms of dissociation. So let's look at some of the degrees, the forms of dissociation, and some of them you will get them. So one of the first things that a child does is, I don't want to feel emotions because I can't resolve them and they're all painful. So let's stuff emotions, disconnect from emotions, because emotions can't be resolved. They only make my life more painful. So they start to not feel. They harden their heart. Then they go, let's just stay busy all the time. Because if I'm constantly distracted with activities, then I don't feel. Then I don't think. So let's have constant distractions. And so that's where people become workaholics, always needing video games, always needing to be doing something because they don't want to feel. That's a form of dissociation. Then you can think of ADHD. For many children, it is actually coming out of this dissociation stuff. They don't want to be present in the present. They don't want to be thinking about going home. Is dad going to be drunk and angry tonight? They don't want to be thinking about last night. They don't want to be thinking about the bully they might run into at recess. It's really hard to be present in the present when you got all of this fear and emotional stuff and stress happening. And so they just have to be, they got all this energy that they got to burn up that's firing away with cortisol, and they can't sit still, they can't concentrate, and it gets diagnosed as ADHD, but they're struggling to be present in the present. They want to be anywhere but in the present. And then you get how it works out in relationships. People, when they're dissociating, they can't be present to other people. Other people are wanting to open up and share with them, and they just can't be emotionally available because they got so much going on inside of them. They want to be anywhere but in the present. And so all of a sudden, they're not very good at being present in relationships. Then others, they go, I will dissociate by escaping into my head. I'll be a walking head. I'm not going to feel emotionally. I'm just going to analyze everything. I'm going to solve everything by finding a formula, by finding information, and solve everything academically. I'll be logical, analytical, and they do that. Others, They escape into a fantasy world. I will just escape into this place where I feel good, where everybody loves everybody, where it's safe, where everybody treats me with respect. It's wonderful. And so their natural ability to use their imagination gets taken to, this is now my escape where I want to live. This is where I want to be present, not in the present. And then some go into depersonalization and derealization, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. And then the most extreme form is dissociative identity disorder, where life is so painful. The trauma is so severe that the brain begins to splinter off the personality in order to protect the innocent child. And so they develop multiple personalities that come into play, all trying to keep the child safe. So let me end today with depersonalization-derealization disorder. And so it's really dissociation in reference to your body and your environment. So we've been talking about this dissociation, and often people think of it in terms of just their emotions, that they're trying to disconnect from painful emotions. Depersonalization-derealization is, I don't even want to feel my body. I don't even want to feel my environment. And so depersonalization affects your ability to recognize your own thoughts, your own feelings, and your own body. You feel like you're watching yourself play a role in a movie, like it's somebody else. You don't even feel sensations in your body. Derealization affects your ability to see your surroundings accurately. Things may not seem real. It's like you're looking through a clouded window or in black and white rather than full color. And we've done a full talk on that as well. So that's the first 10 characteristics of complex trauma and how they affect the body. Next time we're going to continue, but I hope that just again pulls together a whole bunch of stuff. And my whole goal is, I'd really love it if you were to check off the ones that apply to you. And when we get through the 85, if you end up with 85, you go, okay, I got complex trauma. If you end up with 20, you go, okay, I got some issues I need to look at. It's not as severe as others, but at least this helps me kind of know where to focus some of my recovery journey. The whole goal is not to make you feel worse, though you might feel that a little bit. It's to give you insight into where some of your issues come from so that you can begin to grow and heal. Thank you again for being with us. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next time.